First tonight, on the second day of the NATO summit in Washington, support for Ukraine is again dominating the agenda, with NATO leaders saying they would never recognize Russia's annexations, including of Crimea. Opening the summit, President Biden vowed resolve in Europe's modern war and stressed that Ukraine would win the battle against Russia. Speaking in the same hall where NATO's founding treaty was signed in 1949, he took credit for the alliance's expansion and increased defense spending. NATO, he said, was now stronger than ever. And he pledged to provide more air defense equipment to Ukraine, including Patriot missile batteries. But President Zelenskyy, who is also in Washington, urged the United States and others to go further and provide his country with more aircraft, including F-16s. Correspondents say what President Zelenskyy really wants is for Ukraine to be announced as the 33rd member of NATO and for Article 5 to be activated so that other NATO members can send troops to Ukraine to help them fight off the Russians. But they say no one believes that is going to happen.
Today, NATO is more powerful than ever, 32 nations strong. For years, Finland and Sweden were among our closest partners. Now they have chosen to officially join NATO, and because of the power and meaning of Article 5 guarantee, that's the reason. It was the most important aspect of the alliance in 1949, and it is still the most important aspect. I'd also note, Finland and Sweden joined the alliance not just because their leaders sought it, because their citizens called for it in overwhelming numbers. Remember, NATO's character is fundamentally democratic, always has been and always must continue to be. This remarkable progress, proof that our commitment is broad and deep, that we're ready, that we're willing, we're able to deter aggression and defend every inch of NATO territory across every domain: land, air, sea, cyber, and space. My friends, it's good that we're stronger than ever, because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Autocrats want to overturn global order, which is by and large kept for nearly 80 years and counting. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin.
Б'ємося за більшу кількість ППО для України.
We are fighting for a greater number of air defense systems for Ukraine. I'm sure we'll get there. We are fighting for more planes, F-16s. We're fighting for them. We are fighting for additional security guarantees for Ukraine, and these are weapons and finances, political support. We are fighting for the necessary decisive actions of America and Europe, something that will strengthen our soldiers. We will restore Okmint, the children's hospital. I am in touch with the cabinet. There is a first solution, 100 million hryvnias to support Okmint. There will be another 300 million.
President Zelenskyy and before him President Biden. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by Arise European Affairs analyst Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So the first announcements from this NATO summit promising a package of air defense systems for Ukraine, including, crucially, Patriot missile batteries, which Ukraine has called for. I understand they've actually started moving parts of F-16s to Ukraine, and they say another announcement will come offering more support. So presumably, Ukraine will be happy with this level of assistance.
It will be happier than it was before, but whether it's entirely happy is another matter. It's not that much. Sure, the air defenses will improve, but they are defensive, and Ukraine's goal of recovering its territory won't be done by means of defensive missile systems alone. That is, of course, why President Zelenskyy is calling for aircraft. So therefore, it's something, but a long way short of what Ukraine is calling for, and in fact, does not represent that much more than was offered already before the conference.
Just to extend what you're saying there in terms of what they're asking for, I understand Mr. Zelenskyy was also requesting the United States to allow them to use American equipment to target places deep inside Russia.
Yes, this is the escalation that we mentioned before in previous programs, because President Biden and the British have apparently given the go-ahead for this to take place. If it does, the consequences could be severe, because Russia could use this as an excuse to do something untoward and unpleasant. And that is, in fact, what the exchange has been today. On the one hand, the new British Prime Minister has indicated this is certainly possible. On the other hand, the Kremlin has retaliated by stating if British missiles are used on Russian soil, not the Russian-occupied Ukraine, but on Russian soil, there will be a retaliation. And so this is precisely the escalation which I was worried about and which may, in fact, now take place.
And every time you mention these things, almost prophetically, I kind of glance askance to look at your books, because you predicted some of these things quite some time ago. Good reference points, those books, as we continue along this trajectory in Ukraine. But in spite of all this extra support, Dr. Laskiewicz, coming from NATO, what President Zelenskyy really wants, which is for Ukraine to join NATO, doesn't seem likely at this stage, does it? I mean, is it important for Ukraine's survival to have a clear signal that Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO, as President Zelenskyy wants?
A very interesting question, and unfortunately a complicated answer. For a start, it would be against NATO rules for Ukraine to join now, because one of the key rules, and this has prevented Ukraine from joining in the past, is there must be no disputed frontiers. And it's precisely the disputed frontier of Donetsk and Crimea, which legally stopped Ukraine from becoming a member before, and so once again may do so. In other words, NATO would have to overrule one of its rules. Secondly, President Biden himself indicated that Ukraine joining NATO is not all that important. And so therefore, it's highly unlikely Ukraine has the level of support amongst NATO for it to join. And number three, and here comes the point, had it been that Ukraine should have been a member, that could have been years ago. But here comes the third point. The Russians were blocking as part of their sphere of influence. And again, this is once again still the issue. And so therefore, it is most unlikely that he will become, and Ukraine, another member of NATO in the near future.
Very interesting indeed. Meanwhile, while all this is going on with NATO and Ukraine gets more support, I mean, we're seeing Russia holding important state visits, the latest with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and before that with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. How much concern is there over these alliances that Russia is building? Because it doesn't seem at all isolated on the international stage.
No, you're quite right. And most unfortunately, there are three aspects to this. First of all, it means the sanctions more or less aren't working. And indeed, the Russian economy, far from going backwards, is going forwards. That's actually growing. Number two, worse than that, these are very concrete alliances because they are quite specific in the sense that Russia and India, and Russia and China are certainly, and Russia and North Korea are certainly talking about things that can be done, whereas on the Western side, there are more pious hopes of what should happen. After all, although defense spending in NATO should go up, it really hasn't by all that much, though hopefully it will eventually. And therefore, what we're seeing from the Russian side is, as you said, President Putin, certainly not a pariah, an economy which is growing, and if that wasn't bad enough, there's apparently this ICJ warrant for his arrest, and he's quite openly going around part of the world. So therefore, far from this being a moment when Russia should be suffering, it's the very opposite. It's acquiring strength, and therefore, in the near future, there is no possibility, none, that Ukraine will recover any territory. Rather, the worry is that Russia will take still more.
Meanwhile, of course, Dr. Laskiewicz, I imagine Ukrainians are watching the progress of the US presidential election campaign with much trepidation, because the US is, of course, the leading donor of military and other assistance to Ukraine. So if Washington reduces or stops it, it would be impossible to make up the difference. So a lot depends on what happens in America in November, doesn't it?
Yes, and well before November. As you've pointed out on the previous program, a faltering President Biden is indeed a worry, and that is the problem. He gave a very good opening speech, that is true. We've yet to see how he performs over the next day or two, and immediately afterwards, because the calls for him to step aside are growing more vociferous. And therefore, either he may falter in the sense of being incapable, as, for example, during that debate, of actually implementing his policies, or his policies may be blocked internally by people who don't agree with them. And of course, in the offing, there's, as you pointed out rightly, President possible Trump, who would certainly solve the whole situation. And so it is unclear what will happen, except for one thing. Certainly, Ukraine cannot count on full-blooded, competent American support in the coming months. And that means, again, good news for Russia. Hence my previous point that the worry more is that Russia will expand more than Ukraine can in any sense recover its territory.
But of course, on the PR front, bad news for Russia with that attack on that children's hospital in Kyiv.
That's an interesting one. One of the aspects of it is that, first of all, the timing of the attack is very interesting. Just before the NATO summit, it's as if they were showing NATO, they were alive and kicking, as I said before. But more than that, that they were showing that they can still mount powerful attacks, and that therefore they are, in a sense, challenging NATO to do something. It's very disconcerting, because the implication is that if NATO does not reply strongly, and I'm afraid a handful of Patriot missiles doesn't seem to be the sort of reply that's needed, then Russia gains in PR strength. As for the attack on the children's hospital, which is an atrocity, unfortunately, there have been previous atrocities and the world has not really reacted. In my opinion, this atrocity, which I believe from all the evidence at my disposal anyway, is that committed by the Russians, is simply sharpening up, if you like, the weakness of the West in replying, because this is the moment where they have a clear PR advantage and they should have used it to hammer home something to Russia. And all that we've got is essentially pious hopes that the Ukraine will stand. I think in view of this atrocity, more could have been done.
And we're all the better informed for your analysis. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is a RISE European Affairs analyst talking to me there on the line from London.